Well, welcome everyone to Ike Online. We will go ahead and get started this morning. My name is Julie, and I am an educator with the Eisenhower Foundation in Abilene, Kansas. Thank you for joining me today. As we go through this program, I really encourage you to respond to questions or ask questions of your own through the chat. It is always so much more fun to have lots of participation. So we just ask that comments be respectful and relevant to the topic. Okay, let's get started. All right, so welcome to Use It Up, Wear It Out, Make It Do, or Do Without. I don't know if you've heard this before. It's a really old saying. It goes all the way back to the 1940s during World War II. So what does all that mean? Well, I want you to imagine your life changing practically overnight. What if you couldn't buy whatever you wanted to buy at the grocery store? Or maybe even had to start growing your own food? Imagine not being able to buy the toys or games you wanted to buy, not being able to buy clothes whenever you wanted to buy clothes, or a new scooter or a bicycle. Imagine that you had to save everything you used, like you had to save all of the paper you used, metal. You even had to save the cooking fat from cooking your food. What if you couldn't drive your car unless it was absolutely necessary? Does that sound completely crazy? Well, if you were a kid in the 1940s, that's exactly what you had to do. So instead, you had to use it up, which means instead of throwing it away, you had to wear it out until you couldn't use it anymore. You had to substitute things that for other things you didn't have, or you just had to do without. You had to learn to live without it. So today we're going to take a look at what life was like during World War II. Um, and World War II is one of those topics that we talk a lot about here at the Eisenhower Foundation because it is a really important event in history, but also because Dwight Eisenhower was the Supreme Allied Commander during World War II. The United States became involved during World War II when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, in December of 1941. And you can see it there on that video. At that moment, every aspect of American life changed. And as you're going to see, people had to start focusing on the goal of winning the war. So today we're going to be exploring how Americans did that. They helped by using things up, wearing things out, making do with what they had, and doing without things that they enjoyed. Their whole life changed. In this program, we're going to be looking at a lot of primary sources. So primary sources are evidence from the past, and they are created during the time period being studied. So all the primary sources we're going to look at today were created during World War II. Primary sources can include photographs, autobiographies, maps, movies, documents, letters, artifacts, so many things. The important thing to remember is that primary sources are real pieces of history. And if we weren't online, you could actually hold these things in your hands. We're also going to be using some secondary sources. So secondary sources are the result of someone else learning about a topic and retelling it. So examples of secondary sources are books, teachers, maybe your parents, television shows, websites. Me, I'm a secondary source. Secondary sources are also good ways of learning about history. You just have to be really careful about where those sources come from and if they're reliable. Well, our focus today is going to be on the American home front. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's take a look at this map. During World War II, our soldiers were fighting in two theaters or areas of the world. So the yellow area was called the European theater, where we were fighting Nazi Germany. The orange was called the Pacific theater, and that's where we were fighting against Japan. So the American home front, of course, was just right here in the United States. Was the home front close to the actual fighting? No, no, it wasn't. And we're very fortunate that World War II never came, other than Hawaii, never came to the continent where we are. But it meant that there were a lot of shortages, and everyone in the United States knew someone who was fighting in World War II and definitely wanted to help the war effort. There were less goods to go around, however. Sugar, coffee, gas, lots of things were not available like they were before. And things that we had imported from other countries were cut off. The Axis forces, which were Germany and Japan, sunk cargo ships and stopped selling products to the United States. So we had less of those things to buy as well. Making sure our troops, as well as American citizens, had the food and essential items needed for everyday life was a big concern. The government needed to get the word out that Americans were going to have to make some really big but necessary changes. There wasn't any TV at that time. There certainly wasn't any social media at that time. How did they do it? What are your guesses? How did the government get this information out to people about the changes that were going to need to happen? You can put your answer in the chat. Radio, that was one good reason, right? Radio was a major way that people got their news. The other one was through posters. We call them propaganda posters. And believe it or not, you've already seen a few in this presentation, but let's take a look at some more. So propaganda posters were created to inform people about the ways they could help win the war. We're going to be looking at a lot of those posters in this program, and they are all primary sources. First of all, let's talk about what propaganda is. Propaganda uses emotions to prompt action or to persuade people to do something. Okay, so we're going to take a look at a couple of posters and talk about what the intent of those posters are. All right, so here's the first one. This was one that was displayed for people to take a look at. When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. And so you can see kind of a ghost drawing of Adolf Hitler. He was the leader of the Nazi German army. It says, join a car sharing club today. Okay, so what emotions does this poster kind of create? When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. When you see that, you're like, oh, no, no, I don't want to be a part of what? That kind of maybe putting you a little bit on a guilt trip, almost like telling you if you ride by yourself, you're almost a part of the Nazi army, right? So what action are they trying to persuade people to do? Instead of riding by yourself and just using gas for yourself, what are they trying to get people to do? What are your ideas? Have you heard of the word carpooling? Yeah, if several people ride together, then there's less gas used per person and more that could go to our troops to help fight the war. Okay, let's take a look at another poster. Are you doing all you can? Oh, we've got that finger that looks like it's just pointing right at us, right? What emotions do these posters create? If you saw that poster, what would you be asking yourself? What could you put in the chat? Are any of you asking yourself, I don't know, what should I be doing? Right? What actions are they trying to persuade people to do? Thank you to those who are putting some things in the chat for me. It's telling you to yeah, do what the government wants you to do, right? Save things, help out with the war effort as much as you can. Absolutely. All right. So I'm going to give you a chance to look at some more propaganda posters and decide what those posters are persuading people to do. If you have that activity sheet that came with this program, go ahead and get that out. Right? You should see 6 pictures up at the top of actual propaganda posters. Looks like that up at the top. And then below each poster, we see descriptions of what that poster might be trying to get you to do. All right. Do you have that? If you don't, that's okay. You can just follow along with us. So that very first poster that says scrap at the top, and we've got the fist. It looks like it's holding like pieces of metal, different types of things. And then we see, must be a farm, a barn, and a windmill. The next poster says, food is a weapon. Don't waste it. Buy wisely. Okay. The next one says, save your cans. Help pass the ammunition. And it looks like a woman's arm is holding a can of vegetables, tomatoes maybe, and it's kind of just rolling on into a soldier's gun. The fourth one says, me travel? Not this summer. Vacation at home. The fifth one says, save waste fats for explosives. Okay, take them to your meat dealer. Interesting. The last one, can all you can. It's a real war job. All right, so if we look down below at those black squares, the first one says, you can provide our soldiers with powerful explosives to help win the war by saving waste fats from cooking. Which poster talks about that idea? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6? Go ahead and put your answer in the chat. Which one talks about providing our soldiers with powerful explosives through saving fat? 5. Yes, absolutely. Okay, the next one. When you travel, you use fuel that our soldiers need. Americans should vacation at home or risk our soldiers' ability to win the war. Which poster is kind of emphasizing that idea? Yes, poster number 4. Yeah. You just really weren't supposed to drive much at all. So taking a vacation would have really been a bad thing. All right, Americans should can as much food as possible so more food is available for our soldiers. Canning food is an important war job. Which poster talks about that? Yes, poster number 6, can all you can. If you can your own food, You don't need to buy as much food, right? And so then we can send more food to our troops. Americans need to be careful about wasting food, so there is plenty of food for our military. Food keeps our soldiers strong and able to fight. Which poster talks about that? Poster number 2. Yes, right. So that's kind of one of those that goes along with that. Use it up. Don't waste it. Okay, saving scrap metal from the farm will help strengthen our Army's ability to fight the enemy. That's number 1. You're right. Okay. And I like how they use that big, strong arm, kind of like that's going to make our army strong. They're showing strength by saving scrap metal. Okay, and then our last one, housewives can directly impact the war effort by saving cans. Tin cans are used to make ammunition for our soldiers. And that, of course, is number 3. Okay, nice work on that. All right. So during the war, our soldiers needed literally tons and tons of food, supplies, and materials. How could we make sure our troops had enough of everything they needed? So this is where something called rationing comes in. Have you heard of rationing before? What is rationing exactly? What ideas do you have about that? What is rationing? It's not something that we really hear a lot about. It's the controlled distribution of resources, goods, or services. That means you can only get certain amounts of things. Okay. You couldn't go to the store and buy whatever you wanted. You were only allowed to buy a certain amount, and some things weren't available to buy at all. So, we're going to watch a video that explains a little bit more about rationing.
During World War II, there was a battle on the home front, too. The tussle with ration books, tokens, and stamps. Supplies were short, and everything from shoes to gasoline was doled out. No stamps, no soap. Every cut of meat carried a certain point value, and many times stamps were more valuable than money. And rationing proved that the American people had vivid imaginations. The Office of Price Administration was swamped with fantastic tales from people who claimed they faced disaster without an extra allotment of this or that. Headaches were many. Housewives had a problem keeping track of stamps, and businessmen sought clerks and other help in vain. Pity the poor storekeeper when it came time to balance his ration stamp records. Most gasoline ration cards were A cards, which call for an allowance of 3 gallons a week. You couldn't go far, but if you did get rolling, you found empty highways. Yes, Virginia, there once was room on city streets. With most meat going to feed the biggest army in U.S. history, a series of Meatless Tuesdays went into effect. Housewives were urged to save fats for the war effort. They got their reward in extra meat points, and they were also paid 4 cents a pound. And the housewife fought the tin can war, saving food cans for steel and tin salvage. The containers went from the home front to duty on the war front. Everyone was involved in World War II. Then, with victory, the lid was off. Gasoline flowed once more. It was, ho for the open road, fill her up, let's go to the beach, to the mountains. After we get rid of the ration book, America was back on wheels, and rationing was only a memory.
Okay. What were some of your thoughts about rationing? Do you think it would be interesting, fun? Did you see some of those signs in the store that said like no beef today, no butter? That would be something that we're definitely not used to, right? We're used to walking into the store and buying whatever we wanted. Well, once a month, people would go to their local rationing board. That was a group of volunteers who helped hand out ration books. And here's a ration book right here. You can see the stamps inside of it. Um, Ration boards are in lots of different locations. So you would go to the one nearest to where you lived. You would get your ration book and stamps for the month. Every person in your family got a ration book. All right. So you can see that the stamps in there are different colors. So let's take a look at that. So green stamps and blue stamps were used for processed foods, such as bottled fruits, juice, vegetables, soup, baby food, frozen food, dried food. Okay. Those red stamps were used for meat. Black stamps were called spare stamps, and those were used in case the number of stamps needed changed in the future. So let's say that they decided we need to send more meat and more canned foods to our troops. So if you want to buy meat or canned foods, it's going to cost you more ration points. And so you could use your black ones. They could be used for anything if you needed extra ration points. Um, and each stamp had a number designating how many points that it was worth and a letter showing when it should be used. So you couldn't use old stamps. You had to, they are only good for a certain amount of time. Stores then would give back these tokens kind of as change. So you would have to not only count out all of your stamps that you needed, you'd also have to count out tokens if you had any tokens as change. A lot of people had this leather folder to keep it all in one place. All right. It wasn't just food that was rationed. As that video mentioned, gas, clothes, shoes, automobile tires, lots of things were rationed. So, what do you think would happen if you lost your ration book? Let's say you got your ration book at the first of the month, 2 weeks later, you lost it. What do you think would happen? You would be out of luck. You wouldn't be able to get anything. Exactly right. And you couldn't get a replacement ration book. You had to wait until the beginning of the next month to get another ration book. So that would be bad news if you lost your ration book. All right. And since you couldn't get more ration stamps if you ran out before the end of the month, people substituted foods that weren't rationed for foods that were. So if you have that activity sheet again, at the bottom of that page, um, there's an activity where you match the ration food with the food item that often substituted in place of it. So we're going to write the letter of the substitute food underneath the food that it was eaten in place of. All right, so the ration foods, these were the foods that were commonly rationed: butter, sugar, ground beef, processed foods, bread, and hard cheese. Down at the bottom were foods that you could substitute. These were not rationed, or they were foods that you could easily come by. So home canned foods, cottage cheese, lard, that's the fat off of meat, Kraft mac and cheese, that was a thing back then. Kraft mac and cheese was created in the 1930s, honey, and potatoes. All right, so let's decide if you were um, wanting something to eat in the 1940s during the war, and you were out of butter and you couldn't buy any more butter, what could you substitute in place of the butter? One guess was honey. I do like honey on my bread. Which of those foods would be a lot like butter? Butter is a type of a fat. Which of those substitute foods are also a type of fat? Lard, C, exactly. So we'll put a C there underneath butter. All right, sugar. Which of these substitute foods could you use in place of sugar if you ran out of sugar? Honey, absolutely. Yes. How about ground beef? There's actually a couple of down there that you could use to substitute for ground beef. What's one you think would be a good substitute for ground beef? Someone guessed potatoes. That is a good substitute for one of those other products up there. Ground beef is a protein. Which of those other foods would have a lot of protein in them? Cottage cheese was one that was substituted for beef. The other one that was most often substituted, however, was Kraft macaroni and cheese. That was a really inexpensive item that you could buy that was often used in place of meat. How about processed foods? What could you replace store-bought processed foods with? A, exactly, the home canned food. So canning your own food instead of buying it. How about bread? What would be a food similar to bread? Bread is kind of starchy. It's got a lot of carbohydrates in it. Which of those things that we have left also is starchy and has a lot of carbohydrates? Potatoes, you're right. Yes, potatoes were often substituted for bread. Potatoes were something you could easily grow. They were very inexpensive. And so then finally, hard cheese was often replaced with cottage cheese. So why was cottage cheese so plentiful and hard cheese not? Well, hard cheese could easily be shipped overseas to our troops. Cottage cheese might get a little messy, right? So there was a lot more of the cottage cheese available. All right. Well, because rationing and food being in short supply, people were encouraged to plant gardens, and they were called victory gardens, hoping that it would help bring a victory in the war. So you can see another poster about planting victory gardens. It says, "Plant a victory garden. Our food is fighting." That other image you see is actually the cover of a comic book. So yeah, Superman, Batman, and Robin were also planting victory gardens back in the 1940s. Victory gardens started popping up all over the country, and the goal was to produce enough fresh vegetables in the summer to preserve by canning so that your family and your neighbors would have enough food for the winter. In fact, 20 million victory gardens were planted by 1943, and they actually produced a third of all vegetables grown in the United States that year. Well, I have some pictures of different places that victory gardens were grown. They were grown everywhere. Let's see if you can guess where those might be. Okay, so our first picture, take a look. Where do you think this victory garden is being planted? What are your guesses? Go ahead and put those in the chat. And take a look at the clues. You think it's a big city, small town, neighborhood? Yeah, it looks like maybe a small town. It could be maybe a suburb. But yeah, you see all the neighbors. They found an empty lot and they are all working together to plant their victory gardens. So they'll probably all chip in and help take care of the plants, harvest the plants. Okay, here's our second picture. Where is this victory garden being planted?
City.
Yes, this is a big city. You can tell by the big buildings, right? There's a big office building or something there in the background. However, they found a horse somewhere or a mule or something to kind of plow up this empty lot in the city. So it didn't matter where people were living. They found a place to plant gardens. And here's our last one. This one might be a little tricky, but take a look at who is planting this garden and where they might be.
And a school.
A school, you are absolutely right. Even schools planted victory gardens. Wouldn't that be kind of cool to have your own garden? But wherever they could plant a garden, anything they could do to help out, they did it. All right, so these are seed packets from the 1940s. The back of the packets give instructions about how to plant and care for the seeds and the plants as they grow. And those seeds were given away by the U.S. Department of Agriculture during World War II so that you had free seeds to plant your gardens with. All right, so if you were lucky enough to have a garden that produced a lot of food, what would you do with the extra food you couldn't eat? Well, you would can it, right? Absolutely. So take a look at these. These are some other posters. We'll have lots to eat this winter, won't we, Mother? Grow your own, can your own. Am I proud? I'm fighting famine by canning food at home. And they kind of make canning look very pleasant, don't they? Have any of you ever canned anything at home? If your parents canned anything, or if you tried to preserve food at home?
Yes. Apple butter.
Apple butter, oh, yummy. It's kind of a hot, long process, isn't it? Yeah. So they put them in jars at that time that looked similar to that. Some of them had metal lids, and those metal things there at the bottom that look kind of like forks or scissors. What do you think those were? What do you think that was used for? Was used in part of the canning process. We don't really use them like that anymore. Any guesses what those are? How could those be used? They're very necessary in the canning process, unless you want to burn your fingers pretty badly. Those are canning tongs, and they were used to take the hot jars out of the boiling water. That's how you would preserve the food. You would put the jars into hot boiling water, and then you would have to lift them out of the water, and you would use those canning tongs. All right. So there's so much to learn about victory gardens, but let's learn more about victory gardens from this short quiz. Okay, the victory garden quiz. Let's see what we can learn. Okay, which plant was grown the most in World War II victory gardens? So it's going to very slowly start showing you letters. Can you guess what that plant was before all the letters appear? Do we have any guesses? Potatoes? Ah, it was tomatoes. Tomato was the most commonly grown plant in victory gardens in World War II. Okay, let's try this question. Question number 2. How much food was shipped from the United States to the soldiers in Europe during World War II? Was it A, 400 pounds, B, 450,000 pounds, C, 4.5 tons, or D, 4.5 million tons? 1 ton equals 2,000 pounds. How much food did we ship to the soldiers when World War II? It was D, 4.5 million tons of food. That is a lot of food, but they needed it. They were hungry. Okay, we have one more question in our Victory Garden quiz. How many jars of food needed to be canned per person to last through the winter? Was it A, 100, B, 50, C, 10, or D, 25? How many cans per person to last through the winter?
B.
Someone said B,
Yeah,
50?
B.
Oh, the answer is 100 cans per person. Wow, can you imagine? If you had a family with 5, that means you would have to can 500 cans or jars of food. That's a lot of food. That is a lot of food. All right. Well, so Americans were also encouraged to recycle, conserve, and stretch. So that means substitute non-ration items for rationed ones. We talked about that. Reuse as much as possible. Don't just use it once and throw it away. Use it again and again and again. Save and conserve paper, scrap metal, and rubber. And rubber, which is needed to make tires, was especially scarce because the important components needed to make those tires came from countries that were controlled by Japan. And certainly Japan wasn't going to let us have any of that, right? Most citizens received an A stamp, which meant if you would put that in the window of your car or truck, and that means you could only have 4 gallons of gas per week. That's not very much. Most cars can hold like 15 to 20 gallons, trucks a lot more than that. And those yellow stamps that you see there were used to purchase gas for automobiles. If you were a farmer or a business person, you were exempt because definitely farmers would need a lot more gas to grow their crops, and business people would need more gas to deliver their whatever they were selling. But I want you to notice that this little sign says to drive under 35 miles an hour to save tires, to save the rubber on your tires. Now, you know how fast our cars go, right? 55 to 70 miles an hour. What if you could only go 35 miles an hour? That's kind of crazy. All right. Well, because that rubber was in short supply, you could only own 5 tires. 4 of them were going to go on your car, right? That meant you only had 1 spare tire in case one of your tires got ruined. So kids rounded up old tires and items made of rubber that could be recycled and used for the war effort. Paper was in short supply, but in very high demand. So the Federal War Production Board estimated that 30,000 tons of paperboard was needed every single month just to pack artillery shells. That doesn't even count the paper that was needed to make cartons for the K rations that our troops ate, or to package milk. Blood plasma that was needed for injured soldiers was also packed in paper. So these are pictures of food rations given to soldiers. And what are they packaged in?
Paper.
They're packaged in paper boxes, right? So paper was very important. Okay. To encourage kids to save paper, the General Eisenhower War Service Medal was given to Boy Scout troops for extraordinary patriotic achievement. They had to collect at least 1,000 pounds of waste paper to get this award. So in this picture, we can see a Boy Scout troop, and they're actually pictured there with General Eisenhower. You see him there in his military hat and coat. And there's an actual medal that is a primary source. That one's pretty old. and the certificate that was awarded with that medal. School and community groups also had scrap metal drives and contests. Why do you think it was so important to collect all of the scrap metal they could find? What do you think that scrap metal was used for? What would be needed in the war effort that was made of metal? They could take that metal, melt it down. What could they make with it? Jeeps, yes. Ships, absolutely, have lots of metal in them. What else? Trucks,
Bombs.
ammunition, bombs. Yes, the casings on bullets are all made out of metal, aren't they? Airplanes. Okay, so people really work together to help with the war effort. Um, and kids were directly affected by all these shortages as well. Many of the things they played with were no longer available. Because so much metal was needed for the war, cars and bicycles weren't even made from 1942 until late 1945. So you couldn't buy a new car or bicycle. What is a penny usually made out of? Copper. Well, copper was definitely needed during the war. So pennies were made out of steel. So, by the way, if you ever see a steel penny, hang on to it. I think it's probably worth a little bit of money. All right. And because toys were commonly made out of metal or rubber or plastic, you could no longer buy metal toys anymore. So, like metal trucks or things made out of metal are often made out of wood. Dolls or things made out of rubber or plastic turned into like paper dolls, all right, or cloth, things that were not needed for the war effort, all right. And many household items as well. Washing machines, refrigerators were no longer made. Those companies were making things needed for the war effort. And so we're going to watch a video. This is a woman named Hollis Pat Harrison. She took a job in a manufacturing plant, a Maytag washing machine plant. And, you know, it's not unusual now for women to work, but it was very uncommon during World War II for women to work. But most manufacturing jobs, which were done by men, needed to be filled by women since the men were at war. So Hollis talks about her experience working for the first time in a manufacturing job. And let's
Maytag was one of the Iowa firms that stopped producing consumer goods and started making war supplies. In 1943, 19-year-old Hollis Pat Harrison from Albia, formerly Hollis Tarbell, had been working for a local dentist taking care of domestic chores. Harrison saw a newspaper advertisement placed by the Maytag Company in Newton.
All the guys were doing something. They were fighting, going to service, enlisting, and what have you that we knew, and we thought it'd be a good idea for us to do something too while we could, and the money was good.
The company, famous for its clothes washers, started making aircraft parts. Harrison was hired to make exhaust systems for B-26 Marauder bombers. To help finance the creation of war goods, the government began to offer bonds. The investment strategy was not lost on Maytag employees. Together, they purchased a B-26 Marauder for the war effort.
Okay, so pretty interesting, right? A lot of women went to work during the war. So we mentioned earlier about having to save fats and grease from the meats that you cooked. These are a couple more posters that say, housewives, save waste fats for explosives. Save waste fats for explosives. Take them to your meat dealer. How in the world Can grease and fats be used in explosives? Well, um, women or housewives would be given these containers. This was a grease container, and you would just put it on your kitchen counter or your stove. And as you were cooking meat like bacon, you could put the grease drippings into these containers. Once it was filled, you would take it to your butcher or to the store. A butcher is someone who processes meat so that you can buy it. The butcher would send it to a rendering plant. So this would be a place where they would process those fats into glycerin. And glycerin is a key component in the production of explosives and bombs. So yeah, that's a real thing, grease and fats being used to make bombs. All right. Well, as we have learned today, people made a lot of sacrifices during World War II to help our troops. They used less of some things, they did without other things, they grew gardens, they saved paper, metal, cooking grease. Doing these things wasn't for just a month or two. Any guesses? How long did people have to live like this? What are your guesses?
It's like years.
It was years. Any guesses how many years?
6.
Actually wasn't quite 6. 4 years. That's right, 4 years. What do you think would have been the most difficult to do if you were living during that time? All the things that we talked about, what would be the hardest? None of them were very easy. Which one might be the most difficult? I know for me, I love chocolate, and that was a rationed item back then. You couldn't just go to the store and buy a Hershey's chocolate bar.
It was like canning food.
Having to can all that food. Oh my goodness, yes. Especially if you had never done that before. If you'd never planted a garden and you never canned before, you needed to learn how to do that. And then having to can hundreds of jars of food. That's a big job. Yes, I agree. If you had to give up something you have now, what would be the most difficult thing to give up? Kids back then had to give up a lot of things. Your toys, maybe, games, things like that. Okay, so could you give it up though if you knew that eventually you would give it back and you were doing it to help protect your country? Could you do that for years if you knew you're helping your country?
And so yes.
Yeah, yeah, and I think they realized that too, that it was rough. It wasn't easy at all, but it's for something good. Our country needs to be, we're saving our country, right? Okay. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining our program today. Does anyone have any questions they would like to ask before I close the program? Even though some of these things were difficult, it wasn't all bad, right? We recycle today, don't we? It's good to find ways to decrease the amount of trash we produce. So those were probably some good byproducts from that. You might want to think about planting your own garden next spring. Well, we have many more programs that you might be interested in checking out. You can go to the EisenhowerFoundation.net, Ike Education, where you can scan that QR code to see our educator's guide, which gives you information about all of our programs. I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I enjoyed spending some time with you on this topic, and I hope I get to see you again for another one of our programs. All right. Goodbye. We'll see you